terms of facilitating general translation, has made a lot of progress. Now, I'm going to say a bit about Sanger now, because obviously we've been close to this through John Sulston pioneering this data release of the human genome with the NIH and the Wellcome Trust. Now we're a much more general institute. How can we make sure that all of this data that we generate gets out there more easily? And so previously we just had the human genome. Now we've got a load of different types of things. And so we've implemented a lot of stuff within the institute to just try and facilitate data sharing and try and prevent this business, this title, taking control of translation, making sure that you don't get situations where a collaborator tries to grab control of what you've generated in terms of IP, in terms of facilitation or reuse of that data, by tying down the sort of standard rules by which we do research and translate and make that data available. There's a standard set of agreements. So here's our policy, which you can read on the website. It basically says we make the data available almost immediately, wherever possible. There's certain ethical considerations, which means that there's now a class of data where, for ethical reasons, we will make it available, but only to bona fide researchers. It won't be publicly available, but it will be available transparently to all bona fide researchers. So it's not a question of restricting access on the basis you've got a competitor. But we'll do things to make sure that the rights of the data providers are respected, both data we get from people, and we expect people to similarly behave when they take data from us in terms of making sure scientific credit is appropriate. And then in terms of translation, we do take out intellectual property. We take out intellectual property on the basis of making sure that we can control what happens afterwards, that if we don't take it out, somebody else may take it out, and they may not be as kind in terms of making it non-exclusively available to other people who want to translate. And that may involve some delays, but not long delays. So if you're going to do this across a whole institute, 1,000 people, lots and lots of different things, basically you do have to do some work on this. You have to track compliance, be proactive, and we do have those systems pretty much in place now to track data within the institute in all these different areas, and to track the agreements that get signed in terms of collaborations. So also just want to say something about openness. This is now a slight aside, but I'm presenting openness as being translation. It's also, I think, just a very efficient way of doing things. A lot is said about commercial competition, but actually commercial competition is based frequently around monopolies. When you have open data, it's actually more efficient than monopolies in many cases. That's the principle of open source generation. Of course, it's rather destructive to some old business models. And you're seeing a fight right now between old and new business models, because the old efficient business models don't want to die. These are the ones that are based around pre-internet, where there were transaction costs and sharing, and they could survive. They can't survive now, but they're doing a good attempt at trying to. The Digital Britain Bill, which it looks like it's going to go through, it may get defeated at the third reading in the House of Commons, but don't bet on it, is largely driven because there are a lot of corporate interests that want to protect the old businesses around media distribution. And the big danger is that this is going to disrupt a lot of new businesses, which are internet-based and are probably the future. And so, in fact, this is the past interfering with the future in a big way. Right, so go back to this. So here we have, so there's open data, but now what about other kind of stuff? So this is about things that you've discovered, intellectual property, materials. So you can again do this business of controlling translation by making sure that your agreements, your standard license conditions, facilitate what you want to achieve. So funding agencies like the Wellcome Trust, they have a very clear mandate. The objective is to improve public health. It's not to make money. Governments are always nearly interested in making money for the UK, and they'll distort things in that interest against what is necessary in the interest of global public health. Both the NIH and the Wellcome Trust, in fact, they have very similar policies in this. The objective is to facilitate improvements in global health and not to make money. And so after the initial sort of attempts at tech transfer during the 80s, after the Bayh-Dole Act and things like that, they've now become much more sophisticated, and their licensing policies are more structured around making sure that they don't just give stuff away to companies in an exclusive way, which then the companies may do whatever they like with and may block things, but to control this transfer of information in a much more robust way. There are clauses in Bayh-Dole which allow what's called the kind of claw back. If you license to a company and it doesn't actually do anything with the IP that's been licensed to it, there's a march-in clause which allows basically the funding body to pull it all back again. But that's hardly ever been used. But you can write things into these to basically make it non-exclusive, and to make sure that anything you've licensed, anything that maybe comes out of that, is available to academics. So you don't block this cycle here of innovation. So to structure things, structure the deals around making sure that you permanently guarantee the sort of academic development cycle. You can also build things in to enforce access arrangements. I'll mention something right at the end. There's a whole load of universities in the United States that have recently signed up to something saying that if they have IP and they license it, they'll look at, in principle, licensing this on a much more reasonable basis to countries which are classed, by the World Bank as developing or intermediate countries. So there are those kind of things to try and make things more easily. Patent pools were mentioned. That's another way of requiring that. As an institute here, we could potentially require that anything generated subsequently gets put into patent pools, for example, for access to developing countries, things like that. So these are the kind of things, these are some of the kind of things you can do to facilitate translation on a more reasonable basis, to stop this kind of lockdown where companies want to maximize their income. You don't want to make it so difficult for them that they make no income, otherwise they obviously won't do any translation. But there's some sort of line between, at least I believe, between having no translation and having completely unimpeded translation, where you set things so you have reasonable access to the outcoming products, and you have no blocks in the sort of continued cycle of development. Now, these are some of the things that have been discussed around reducing transaction costs. For example, if there's a patent that's involved, if you've got a patent, and that may stop a whole load of people doing follow-on innovation or commercializing that because they can't get funding, because they don't know in advance what they've got to negotiate with you. There are structures like the structure IBM adopts, where IBM says,